The first organized effort to gain more rights for women happened within the anti-slavery movement. The people who became identified with the women's rights movement learned how to be activists in what some of them referred to as the school of anti-slavery. I mean, very much came out of that constituency and out of that sense that dramatic moral changes were required.
Before the Civil War, the idea of freeing slaves and the idea of women voting are both pretty radical suggestions.
The reaction to the women's suffrage movement was really negative, and it was not at all inevitable that this should happen.
Before the Civil War, people who supported women's rights and abolitionists were largely overlapping groups. And it's only after the Civil War, when dramatic moral and political choices were made, that there was some separation in the groups.
The 19th century, white Americans, North and South, were very racist. And there were a lot of ideas about racial hierarchies. And a number of white suffragists were educated middle and upper class women and felt very frustrated that they didn't have the right to vote when recently enslaved African American men did. So the movement really splits over this question. Many African American women saw black men's votes as really a community vote, and that black women could sort of engage with black men and that their concerns would be heard in politics. White women were really more frustrated that black men would get the right to vote before they did.
What happens is you have some white women who are saying, look what you've done. You've given power over white women to black men, to ignorant, degraded black men. And you heard those two words be used over and over again. Ignorant and degraded black men have now gotten the vote and will now have power over white women. And even that idea that they would have power over white women was kind of leaning into one of the most damaging kind of stereotypes of the era, which was that black men were a threat to white women's purity. And so that kind of thing gets exposed through the passage of the 15th Amendment, and that makes it very difficult for those movements to kind of move forward together in the way that they maybe had previously.
So you saw the splintering of the women's rights movement in terms of what they were tactically trying to seek, and also ideologically in terms of the support for African Americans. You do see white women suffrage activists really taking a racist turn as they recognize that to get a national amendment, you need to get a certain number of states.
So they're pragmatically and strategically thinking about who their audience is, which is white male voters, and how to get them to pass women's suffrage. But in doing so, they really mean white women's suffrage, and they abandon their African American allies.
Compromises are always going to be made in order to win things, and then you decide what compromises are too much for you to swallow. And there were many suffrage activists who found that too much to swallow, including African American ones. This was not worth it.
She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you are lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you.
The 19th Amendment for Black women is in some ways a paper victory, but it only gives them what they need to go forward to continue fighting to have that right realized.
So it really was a relatively limited number of women that were enfranchised. Mexican American women largely were not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. Native American women were not. Chinese women were not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment.
I think that the passage of the 19th Amendment is worth commemorating if we notice that it didn't accomplish all the goals of the women's movement and that it didn't end the struggle. The next month, Alice Paul was out there proposing an Equal Rights Amendment. Black women were out there demanding that their right to vote be respected. Lots of other people participated in struggles that were ongoing. But I think we prefer to tell stories, and this is, as I say, a problem with commemoration in some ways, we prefer to tell stories that have neat endings, which look like victories.
The struggles never really end. New generations or new strategies come into play and really push for the promises to become more real.